Thank you very much, Peter. Welcome to everybody to today's SMCR event. I think it's probably the last, Peter, in the SMCR events that the association has been holding on this particular subject, and it's good to see you all here today. We've got a great lineup of speakers. It doesn't come much better than this, but we're still waiting for one to turn up, so he will very discreetly and seamlessly walk in a bit later. So let's have a quick look at today's agenda or presentation. But basically, we're going to have 2 half-hour sessions followed by Q&As, a short Q&A after the first session and a slightly longer one after the second, all with the aim of a 2:30 finish, because I know that some of you have got to get back to your desks this afternoon. We've got quite a lot to get through, so we'll keep things moving as quickly as we can. Moving on now to the first session, which is our speaker, John King. John is an ex-regulator and I think a familiar face to some of you, certainly to the MGAA. He left the FCA in April of this year, having spent 16 years there, which is a pretty fair innings, I would say, for a regulator. And he now runs his own consultancy business. At the regulator, John was responsible for the supervision of insurers and intermediaries, covering a wide range of issues. And his project work included governance and culture, SMCR, which we are of course talking about today, pricing practices, and the IDD. And what John is going to do is walk us through the SMCR framework as it applies to MGAs. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Norman, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. As Norman said, we've got quite a lot to get through, so we'll scratch the surface of SMCR, but we're around afterwards if you've got questions as well. So, a bit of context as to why we're here with SMCR. The FCA and the PRA places a lot of credit. Firms' culture and governance is a very important issue. It's one of the business plan priorities. It's one of the ongoing priorities. And the reason it's one of the ongoing priorities, it's such a big topic, it is not something that's going to get fixed in a year. It's always going to be there. And up on the slide, you can see extracts from the FCA's business plan that came out in April this year. And SMCR is a huge plank in how the regulator is going to improve culture and governance in the firms that it regulates. To summarise, if you get culture and governance right, everything else will follow from that. The flip side, if you've got poor culture and poor governance at your firm, then that's likely to lead to poor customer outcomes and increased harm to either customers or the market. And harm is a big word that the FCA uses now as to how it measures things, how it takes the action that it does. So whilst the FCA was putting out its business plan in April, this was what was going on in Lloyds. So this isn't a cheap shot at Lloyds, and in fact, very timely with this week where they've announced the results of their culture survey, and as John Neal has said, it's not good news. A lot of sort of sexual harassment and bullying, and fair play to Lloyds, they are taking steps to address this. And you may say, why is all that of interest to the FCA and the regulator? Is the FCA and the regulator the moral police, as it were? The answer to that is, well, no, not the moral police. But I think, if you have a bullying and harassment culture internally with your firm, that is going to leak across into how you deal with the customers and the market. So that is why, the FCA is very interested in that. Senior people spoke at the Dive-In Festival earlier this week. And as you'll see, when you get onto the conduct rules, it's hard to say these are the conduct rules that apply to our financial services business and how we deal with customers, and not how they deal across the whole of your firm. So Moving on to SM and CR itself then, and pulling out some words from this slide as to what it's all about. Individuals more accountable. This is really about people. It's people that can influence and change, culture at a firm. As part of this, the SMCR aims to encourage staff at all levels. So it's not just the senior managers, it applies to everyone at a firm, taking personal responsibility for their actions. It makes sure that firms and staff clearly understand and can demonstrate where responsibility lies. This is so that if the FCA goes in and says who's responsible for that, they don't get the answer. So this isn't going to come well on the podcast, but pointing, I thought it was him, it wasn't me. So great more individual accountability. Now, in a way, we're fortunate here as general insurance intermediaries, because the banks and the insurers have already had to go through this, and the FCA has learnt from that and adopted a more proportionate regime for the solo regulated firms, which insurance intermediaries are. And so there's various sizes of firm applicable for this. And just to get some interaction, a quick show of hands, who has had their letter from the FCA setting out which sort of type of firm they are for SM and CR purposes? It's a bit worrying, but having said that, and no, I mean, that's perhaps more a problem at the FCA. And I've asked that before, and it usually only get a few show of hands, but it was something that they said they were going to do, to write to firms to say where they fall in this regime. Having said that, it is relatively straightforward to work out where you sit, because for insurance intermediaries, the metric is your regulated income from your RMAR, so it's your commission and fee income, and that's so not premium income, but commission and fee income. And if it's less than 35 million, you are a core firm. Now, I would say most people in this room are core. I know and I've spoken to some over lunch, I know we've got some people who are from bigger groups, and they might be enhanced, and we'll touch on that in a minute. But really, in terms of the enhanced firms with greater than 35 million of fee income, that's probably like a top 50 broker intermediary that you're talking about. Have we got any sole traders here? Probably unlikely. They're at the very sort of bottom of it, sort of what's called a limited scope. So for most of this presentation, I'll be pitching it to you as how this applies to core firms. Now, there's 3 tiers to the regime, and you could think of it as a pyramid. First bit is the senior managers regime, and perhaps more of a show of hands than we had last time. Who here is an approved person at their firm already on the financial services register? Okay, so a few of you. You're probably going to fall into this top tier, the senior managers regime, and we'll be going through them all in a minute. Then the middle tier, which is a new thing, the certification regime. That's more like the middle management, and that is going to be putting the onus onto the firm, because if you have certified people at the firm, it's going to be you as the firm who's going to be responsible for assessing whether they're fit and proper, not the regulator. And then finally, at the base of the pyramid, you've got the conduct rules, which apply to virtually all staff. So looking at those in more detail, the senior managers regime is going to replace the approved persons regime. The caveat there, except for appointed representatives, which sit outside this regime at the moment. And as it suggests, it's focusing on the senior people. They are approved by the FCA. SMCR is all about responsibility. So a new thing being introduced is a duty of responsibility, which is where you could be held accountable if you didn't take reasonable steps to prevent or stop a breach of rules occurring. A key document under this regime is the statement of responsibility. All senior managers should have those, basically explaining, as it suggests, what they do, what they're responsible for. Going forward, that will be filed with the FCA where there's changes to your senior managers, where there's changes to the scope of what they do. And this is going to be the key thing, that if the FCA comes in to visit your firm because of a problem or an issue, it's probably going to be one of the first things they ask for. Show me your statement of responsibility so that they can see who the person area is responsible for that. Prescribed responsibilities, the FCA has set out some responsibilities that firms must include, and we'll touch on those in a minute. But in the above, in the statement of responsibilities, that's more free text for you. And obviously that depends on how you run your business, how big it is, how many operations it's got, the like. Another thing that's come into play is regulatory references. So where you're taking on new staff, you need to get a regulatory reference. There is a template for that. And I think, worth saying at this point, and I know something that Browne Jacobson are going to touch on more in their session, SMCR isn't just about compliance. There's a huge HR angle to how this regime is going to be implemented in firms. Likewise, you need to do criminal records checks, although some of you may be doing that already, because under the existing IDD, Insurance Distribution Directive, there's a requirement to check your staff for good repute. And then the conduct rules also apply to senior managers as well. So for core firms, again, this is the FCA being proportionate, and there's quite a limited number of SMFs that you can have. I don't know if we've got any partnerships here, because that would rule out the SLF 27. Apologies, probably quite hard to read this, but the slides will be coming through. But basically, there's the SMF 1, which is the chief executive function. There's the SMF 3, the executive director, which is current directors. Confusionally, in a way, the FCA have swapped around the current CF1 and CF3s. And then, don't know how many of you have got non-executive directors, CF2s, currently at your firms? Okay, so that is something that will fall away under this regime, unless one of your NEDs is a chair, in which case you have to fill in a form to opt them back in. And the reason for that is that under the current setup, where it's just CF2s, the FCA doesn't know which one of those is a chair. Interestingly, has anyone only got one approved person at their firm? That makes it very easy for that person as to who's accountable and who's responsible. If you've just got one person, this is quite an easy job for you to do. Those bottom two functions, if you can see them, I mean, this is from the guide, which is for all solo regulated firms, is called the required functions, which is SMF 16 compliance oversight and SMF 17 MLRO. But as a GI firm, you are not required to have those, so that probably doesn't apply to you. Only if you've got consumer credit, lending permissions, then that brings you back in. So in a way, for core firms, this is quite a straightforward mapping exercise. For enhanced firms, there's a lot more functions that are available. So these are the prescribed responsibilities that you have to have. So the best way of doing this is to look at them and then cut them up and allocate them out to relevant and most appropriate SMFs in your firm. This will be part of the statement responsibility. So the first three of those prescribed responsibilities are really how this regime is implemented. So, someone is responsible for the senior managers, someone is responsible for ensuring the firm complies with its obligations under the certification regime, and then similarly in how the firm rolls out and complies with its obligations in respect of the conduct rules. So that really is going to be a named individual or individuals at your firm with responsibility for complying with this regime. The other two, perhaps a couple of old traditional ones, someone needs to be responsible for financial crime or have that responsibility. And then the last one is CAS, client money. I would say probably a lot of you as MGAs probably have risk transfer from your insurers and don't have permission to hold client money. But nevertheless, you still need to allocate this responsibility out to someone, probably your finance director, and their role is I suppose, just making sure that you're not holding client money inadvertently. So within the certification regime, and as I said earlier, this is new. This is pushing the onus onto the firm. They're not approved by the FCA. I think in the past, FCA has perhaps felt that firms haven't done enough due diligence when they're taking on new people. They've left it to the regulator to do that as part of the approved person process. And these are defined as roles that can have a big impact on customers, markets, or the firm. And really you need to decide whether you've got any in your firm. As you'll see at the bottom there, it could be quite acceptable for a core general insurance intermediary to say, well, we don't have any staff in that bucket. I think we're covered with everyone. We've got enough people at the SMF level to cover that. If you do have certified staff, then you need to assess them on an annual basis that they're fit and proper. So again, this brings the HR department into play in terms of doing that. The FCA has set out some existing functions that must be certified in the new regime. I don't know if we've got any firms here that have IFAs in their either in their firm or in other group companies, but this is a much bigger hit for them than it is for general insurance intermediaries, because basically the CF30 advisor function is falling away, but coming back in as a certified function. So you can see there, some of the big IFA networks are going to have quite a job in terms of the number of sort of certified staff that they've got. One that you may have in your firms currently is the significant management function, what's known as the CF29 currently. That falls away as an SMF, but again, is expected to come back in at the certification layer. For those people as well, there's regulatory references required, and as do all staff, they have to comply with the conduct rules. So as I said, don't think most general insurance firms might not need anyone. I think the only area I would think about is IT, as that's a sort of big risk for a firm. If you think that who can cause harm to the firm, then that might be one there that you'd want to certify. And obviously, if you've got group functions, that's something to look at as well. Moving on then to the conduct rules, and perhaps getting to the core of this now. This applies to all staff, and not only just for the regulated activities, but the unregulated financial service activities as well. And going back to my sort of Lloyds slide earlier, you can see that this perhaps applies to personal behaviour as well, and something that Browne Jacobson are going to comment on in their session. And one of the things that the FCA has put out, and is worth a listen as well, is a podcast with Johnson Davidson and Dame Jane Ann Godella, who used to be at Virgin Money. Now, she says that these conduct rules are basically codifying expected behaviour. It's perhaps a shame that we've come to that, but that is where we are. It's quite hard, I think, to argue against these conduct rules. Why wouldn't you want your staff to act with integrity? Why wouldn't you want them to act with due care, skill and diligence? And you can see that the other ones are there as well. So this is quite basic stuff. Again, from an HR angle, if staff breach these conduct rules and go through formal discipline procedures as a result of that, then that is something that is reportable to the FCA going forward under this new regime. For the senior managers, there's some additional conduct rules, and again, fairly common sense sort of stuff in how you run your business. So moving on to the implementation, and this is the 9th of December, so you think still some time yet. One thing I would say, 9th of December is only 39 days after Brexit. You may want to get your SMCR stuff done now before the 1st of October, because who knows what's going to happen in November. But by day one, what you should have done, or you have to do, is identified your senior managers and certification staff. and train senior managers and certification staff in the conduct rules. Now, SMCR, I mean, the title of the presentation, is there still time? I would say yes. And the reason I say, is there still time, is because this isn't something that's finished on the 10th of December. You can't say, tick, we've done SMCR now, let's move on. If you look at what you've got to do in the next year, you have got to, if you've got certified staff, conduct fit and proper assessments for them, and you've got to roll train all your other staff in the conduct rules. So, this is a big ongoing commitment and requirement. Now, in terms of conversion, as I said earlier, for core firms, your current approved persons, except the CF2s, will automatically map across. For enhanced firms, there's a bit more work involved. You need to tell the FCA, who's fitting in where under the new regime. So wrapping up now with a couple of slides on sort of practical points in terms of what you should be doing. Firstly, identify what type of firm you are. As I said there, the FCA should have been writing to you, but it's quite easy to work it out for yourselves. Then identify who your senior managers are and your certification staff and the staff covered by the conduct rules. Now, what you might want to do here as part of a clean-up exercise is look at who you've currently got on the register. Are they still alive? In some cases, a bit of a, who's down at Company's House as a director of your firm. So again, I think this is a way, you can take a good opportunity to look at how your firm is organised. Another thing to look at, under IDD, you could say we already have some responsibility. Some person is named on the register with responsibility for insurance distribution directive. Is that still the right person in how you're going forward? I've seen it. Does that person even still work at your firm? I've seen that where people have left. Now, this isn't, as I said earlier, this FCA is being proportionate here. This isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. So, SMCR doesn't require firms to change your governance structure or hire new people to fill specific roles. But I think, obviously, if you're going through this exercise and you think you see that you've got some massive gaps, then you might want to look at that. We're now open for the window for SMF applications. What you may want to do is get people in now under the old regime, because then they will automatically convert across, and so you might not have to go through some of the regulatory references, the criminal records checks. But I'm hearing that there's a backlog is starting to build up at the FCA in terms of processing these applications. I have got one in myself, got another INED role, subject to regulatory approval, those caveats, but if I can't get it, then presumably no one else can. So then the next step is drawing up those statements of responsibilities for the people, so for the senior managers, giving them their statement of responsibilities. I think, as a sanity check, what you should do at your firm is reconcile this to your risk register. What you wouldn't want is something being a massive risk on your risk register, but no one having responsibility for that in your statement of responsibilities. It's also worth looking at the FCA's GI priorities. So, the like of the Dear CEO letter in terms of the distribution chain, which hopefully you have all seen, and does, make specific reference in that to the senior managers and certification regime and individual accountability. So I would expect for an MGA, in its statement of someone in its statement of responsibility is going to have, I am responsible for the oversight of our brokers and the distribution chain that we use. Another firm that I'm working with, and Peter Townsend is here today from Gilchrist, that is a solution to look at your brokers, and Peter's spoken to some of you already and is happy to talk to you. Other areas that the FCA is interested in, pricing, hot topic at the moment. So who at your firm is responsible for pricing? That is something that should be included in the statement of responsibility. Again, low value products, value measures work. Who is responsible for product governance? These are things that, vulnerable customers is another thing. These are things that we would expect to see in a statement of responsibility. Now, if some of you are with big groups, SMCR is at the regulated legal entity level. So if you've got someone, and we've got people here from the Ardonna Group, number of regulated entities in those groups, if people sit across regulated entities, they need a SOR for each regulated entity. I think one thing to think about where you're in a group and some of your functions are at an unregulated group company or another group company, and IT again is a good point for that. Someone at the FCA would see that as outsourcing. So someone at your legal entity needs to have in their statement of responsibilities, I am responsible for the oversight of the outsourcing of our IT, to firm X. Things I said earlier, it's a big HR issue as well. A lot of work coming down the track for them, regulatory references, criminal records checks, assessing certification staff, reporting the breaches of the conduct rules to the FCA. What you may want to do is link those conduct rules to IDD requirements. The directory is coming for certified staff. That is going to be an issue for them. And as I said, appointed representatives are not in the regime, but someone in your firm, again, in their statement of responsibility, needs to take ownership of that and have, I am responsible for the oversight of our appointed reps. As I say, the FCA has learned from the implementation of this in terms of banking and insurers, and so has put out some quite handy guides. As I mentioned earlier, there's some podcasts on there, and obviously we're all here to help you implement as well. But thank you for your attention during my session, and we've got time for a few questions.
Yes, indeed. Thanks very much for that, John. You've run exactly to time, which is always a good thing. So we do have 5 minutes or so to pause for any questions on the things that John has been talking about, if anybody wants to ask a question.
No, can I go first?
Please do, Jeff. Yeah.
Might be the silliest question on the planet.
No such thing. Yeah.
How do you actually go about getting a criminal record check? Do I just ring the police?
No,
In your case, Jeff.
Does MGA have a facility or not? I know Viva has a facility for its members.
It's I think the thing that you'll need to do is probably use an umbrella organisation like Disclosure Scotland, where you can do these things on request. Otherwise, you have to register with the DBS. We can pick up on that separately, Jeff, but it is not something I'm thinking that a lot of you will need to be doing, or you won't be doing it with any great frequency. So I think the umbrella organisation is probably the most practical route to go down. And of course, the checks will need to be done at standard level, not just the basic level check.
It's going to affect us all on a regular basis.
It won't affect existing people who are migrating across into the, isn't that correct, John?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. It's only new recruits where you'll have to do the new senior managers.
It covers all new recruits.
Only if they're SMS at the senior managers level.
Norman, I've got a question here from a member who couldn't come today. And it's basically for John, of course, if SM&CR makes senior managers responsible, how does it work in practice around staff harassment or bullying? I.e., what if you say to someone that they are bullying and they're not? Likewise, how does that also work for someone under the influence of maybe drug or drink? And we know the conversations that I've had with the PRA, they're looking very serious at the managers or the senior manager regime of an individual below them who may be actually bullying.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very good question. Obviously, I touched on it a bit in my Lloyds slide. I think perhaps if we leave it until after Browne Jacobson have spoken, because I think that's an area that they're going to cover. But I think, point I would make is, yes, these disciplinary breach, it's quite hard to have one set of code of conduct rules for, how you deal with customers and the market, and another one what goes on internally in your firm. It's a bit. I don't think you can. It's a bit schizophrenic to have something like that. So the regulator is interested, but I'm sure Browne Jacobson are going to cover that in more detail.
Yes, obviously, as lawyers, bullying and harassment is well within our skill set. So we'll definitely
Excellent.
on that.
Yeah, thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Somebody's dying to ask something, I'm sure, over the side. No? Okay. In which case we'll move on to the second session. And I'm going to hand over now to Jeremy Irving and Ian Deakin of Browne Jacobson. And Jeremy is a partner and head of financial services at Browne Jacobson, and he specialises in conduct, prudential and governance regulation. His work includes M&A, delegation and outsourcing, product development and distribution, investigations and enforcement. That's quite a nice cocktail there. Ian is a senior associate within the firm, and he specialises in matters such as employment tribunal litigation, executive terminations and 2P transfers. And Ian works alongside the firm's regulatory and commercial lawyers and its specialist HR team. So over to you guys now.
Thank you, Norman. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about real-life examples of bad conduct, real-life examples of that, the two sides of the same coin that John talked about, which is a failure in culture giving rise to a failure for appropriate and proper outcomes in terms of customer treatment, business operations and compliance. And the examples I'm going to go through are all from the general insurance market. They're all within the last few years. So obviously they're not within SMCR or its introduction for the insurers, banks and other deposit-taking and risk-carrying institutions over the last now 10 months or so, but they are nevertheless very good indications of what makes unfit and improper conduct and what would trigger reporting to the FCA and what would mean that an individual would not be suitable to be a senior manager and potentially even not suitable to be a certified function personnel. The three areas to look at, again, linked to culture and in particular training, and as John has explained, training is a vital way of shaping and managing culture. So we've got failure to understand regulatory rules, we have a breach of the firm's own policies and procedures, and we've got a failure to prioritise treating fair treatment of customers over executive remuneration. Some of you may think these are freakish, egregious examples. Some of you may feel they're but for grace, and I'm going to give you a little more detail around that. But the purpose of this is to give you all a takeaway, so you could help set parameters and benchmarks on conduct and behaviour within your own businesses. There is also a sort of flip side to this, which is, well, if we get to the 9th of December and we're not ready, or somebody we want to distribute through isn't ready, how do we manage that situation? What are the issues around that? In particular, how are insurers going to approach this? That's a different topic for a different day, and that day happens to be the 8th of October, when Browne Jacobson are hosting an event for insurers and MGAs, where I'll be speaking on that what-if scenario for the next year. Anybody who hasn't received an invitation, the MGA have been kindly enough agreed to send on the invitations to that event if people would like to come and Ian will also be speaking on another issue. So, Mr. Radford, he was a CF3 Chief Executive of One Call Insurance Services. He was in charge of client assets and compliance with the client asset rules. One Call was an insurance broking business which grew very, very quickly. And one of the reasons, reading the subtext in this enforcement notice, it was able to grow so quickly is because of the process they used for managing multi-year policy premiums. So One Call's great USP was that it was able to advertise 3-year deals. So if you subscribe to a One Call broker policy in year 1, they would hold the premium for the next 2 years, obviously subject to no claims and so forth. They persuaded premium finance groups to fund these 3 years worth of premiums up front. And obviously the first year's premium was passed to insurers on policyholders' behalf. The next 2 years worth of premium was then taken and invested by One Call, thus growing its own business. But there was not sufficient analysis, as the FCA found in its final notice, of whose money that was, the legal issues around the ownership of the money, the regulatory issues around the ownership of that money, and whether it should have been done at all. And Mr. Radford was found to have been largely ignorant of the relevant rules and the relevant considerations. So here you have a prime example of the impacts, and Mr. Radford, of course, was fined and banned from holding senior positions in the financial services market. This is a prime example of the impact of a failure to understand the regulatory rules, and this will be an important feature of SMCR. It's demonstrating and permanently demonstrating, not just ticking the box on, understanding and applying the regulatory rules. This is Mr. Phillip from Towergate. Towergate had a system, as explained in the FCA final notice, whereby the different parts of the group would aggregate monies at a certain time. So there was a procedure for reviewing monies that have come into the group across its various businesses, and the idea was that the monies so collated would be sorted into monies due to insurers' premiums, monies that were owed to customers, and any spare money was largely assumed to be commission fees and other remuneration due to Towergate. Again, reading between the lines, it does appear that the board of Towergate, and Mr. Phillip in particular, responsible for running the finance section, were under a lot of pressure to move substantial sums of money up to one or more holding companies in Towergate in order to service debts incurred by the group. Unfortunately for Mr. Phillip, he did not sufficiently look into the potential problems and the risk created by that aggregation system, and indeed whether there was a risk, in particular whether there was a risk that monies that were assumed to be Towergate might actually belong to somebody else. Large sums of money, as you can see from the slide, were moved up to the holding company, but even more, unfortunately for Mr. Phillip, in ensuring that the money was moved, large amounts of money was moved, he didn't actually follow his own team's, his own firm's policies and procedures. Now, that would seem to be a blindingly obvious statement, but clearly it took this enforcement notice and the investigation enforcement proceedings to bring that message home to Mr. Phillip and within the Towergate group. So here you have a prime public example of how failure to follow own policies and procedures is reflective of a failure in culture, a failure in training, and improper outcomes. And again, remember, with the concept of improper outcomes from the regulators, it's not necessary that anybody should actually have suffered any loss or detriment. it was never actually proven, and the FCA didn't need to prove, that any customers' premium had gone astray, that money had not been paid to insurers on time, and so forth. All that the FCA needs to demonstrate is that what went on created risk, in particular risks, and that's why you have the last two bullet points there. Mr. Phillip failed to identify the risks inherent in that system, and he failed to create systems to manage them. That's aside from ignoring his own policies and procedures. So again, some clear language which you can take away and use in your compliance manuals and HR manuals, and training systems, and so forth, in order to help with your implementation and ongoing compliance with SMCR. Finally, we have the Swinton 3, if you will, Messrs. Bowyer, Clare and Halpin, who were directors, one of them was the CEO. This is all to do with add-ons, an area of some considerable controversy for some time within the general insurance sector. What the enforcement notices against these individuals, and again, the sanctions we're looking at are bans in the market and personal fines. And this squarely brings out the concept of culture, because what was found by the FCA published in its final notices was that between these individuals, they had created a culture to drive sales of add-ons in particular, and that culture pretty much rode roughshod over compliance reporting, the effective operation of the compliance function, and above all, that culture was to benefit the most senior managers and their remuneration systems. So here you have, within this slide and certainly within these three final notices, very sort of textbook case, if you will, for what goes wrong in the event that you can't manage or can't understand how to manage the need to be paid well, for the business to grow and to be effective and to pay its debts and all the rest of it. You can't manage that against the need to treat customers fairly and against the risk of not treating customers fairly. So now I'm going to hand over to Ian. Just a final word really on this concept of culture and technical failure and cultural failure being two sides of the same coin. Some of you might have noticed that all of the individuals who were sanctioned in the slides were male. Now, some of you may feel that that is merely a statistical reflection of the weight of balance of employment within the general insurance industry. It is perhaps a different subject for a different day, but when you weigh up the current stream of information, and particularly when you start thinking about how the regulator, and especially the FCA, is looking at these issues within the general insurance market, you may feel that some of the issues are gender or relate to specific gender characteristics, and whether the correct way to address that culture and to correct that culture, particularly thinking about the link in the Lloyds reports between sexual harassment, etc., and excessive alcohol consumption, is the solution actually lies within diversity, and diversity is a driver of cultural change. But as I've said, that's a very broad topic for a different day, but it's certainly worth thinking about in terms of practical issues such as recruitment and promotion. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Ian.
Thank you very much. A bit of a confession to make. Before I started working with Jeremy on SMCR, I didn't really appreciate why it would be such a big employment law issue, but you only have to sort of scratch the surface for a couple of minutes and you realise that to all intents and purposes it is an employment law issue as much as it is a regulatory one. Because all of the regulatory framework the FCA is laying down has to apply to people, it has to apply to organisations, and organisations are manned by people. So it's not just a question of a regulatory framework, you've got to use a cheesy phrase, bring this stuff to life, and the way you do that is by putting it to your workforce. And it's it impacts it in every stage of the employment relationship, even before it started and after it's ended. So it's going to impact the way that firms caught by this framework deal with pre-employment, steps they have to take before employment, and John's already touched on some of those. During employment, steps that have to be taken in terms of the certification regime, annual fit and proper persons assessments, and then post-employment regulatory references and the like. I just want to touch on one thing before I get into the rest of my presentation. It's to pick up the question that was posed earlier from our colleague who isn't here today, and it dovetails on the point that Jeremy's just made. And it's the other big takeaway I've got from SMNCR is that it's much wider than the pure financial baddies, if you like, that Jeremy was referring to earlier. And I'm actually looking at a letter that was written by Megan Butler, Exec Director of Supervision, Investment, Wholesale and Specialist at the FCA, following a meeting with the Right Honourable Maria Miller MP, Chair of the Women Equalities Committee, Parliament. And I'd recommend encourage you to read the letter. It's a year old now, but the points it makes are still valid. 3 paragraphs down, bold, sexual harassment is misconduct which can drive a poor culture. As I outlined at the hearing, we view sexual harassment as misconduct which falls within the scope of our regulatory framework. That's got nothing to do with any of the financial impropriety we're talking about. This stuff might have been born out of the financial crisis, and born out of the sort of behaviour that Jeremy was referring to earlier, but it goes much wider than that, and it's about trying to fix the culture the FCA is within the industry. As a postscript to that, Jeremy and I were speaking to another client about this yesterday, and we're doing a number of sessions with clients, just talking to them about this, as part of their requirement to talking to them about this issue. And it was fascinating to see in that meeting, people starting to ask questions and starting to figure out, well, actually, what do I have to know? Like, when does this come down on me? What are my responsibilities going to be? And then in between sessions, he was actually speaking to the HR director, asking questions about it. So in a strange way, just having that session, not to blow our own trumpet too much, has actually started to do what the FCA wants it to do, which is start to look at this stuff seriously. So preparation, in order to bring SMCR to life, and by the way, I'll go through these, and I've got some examples at the back end of the slides for how these amendments might look in practice, just a short example about a few of these things in practice. So preparation for employing people, you allow existing contracts of employment. Of course, we'll all have existing contracts of employment, but in the SMCR world, we need to be making amendments to those contracts where we can to make explicit reference to things like, for senior managers, duties of responsibilities, statement of responsibilities. They're separate documents, but you'd want to have them referred to the employment contract in my view. And you'd want to make compliance with those requirements a disciplinary offence that you can take action in appropriate circumstances. A job description today might be slightly different than it will be on the 9th of December because it's going to have, the new world post 9th of December, because we're going to have things like, again, statements of responsibilities. I'm listing documents that might currently exist in a pro forma, but they're also going to have to be used and implemented when we're in the SMCR world. And appraisal documents, at the moment, most companies these days do have an appraisal process, but more and more companies are moving away from this notion of an annual sit down where we sit down and talk about how things have gone. And just as an aside, so Browne Jacobson, for example, we don't do that anymore. The way that we've changed is to have an ongoing culture of talking about performance and things like that. That's great in certain sectors, and it's quite a useful thing to do. But that wouldn't quite work here unless you've also got the ability to sit down and say, right, is this person fit and proper? We need to be making sure we're ticking these boxes, and we need to make sure we're living this regulatory framework. Training, and as a point that John made before, that's a requirement pre-9th of December. But it's not just a question of talking to the people who are going to be impacted by this. It's not just a question of talking to senior managers, talking to people who are going to be caught by the certification regime. I guarantee some of them won't know what it is. And I don't say that, I say that neutrally. And again, we did a session yesterday, and there was a gentleman in there who came across to me at least as being quite surprised. He didn't really realise what this was, and when he started to think about it, he appreciated the gravity and how it's going to impact on it moving forward. But it's also important that your HR department know what this is and are equipped to talk to people about it. It's not just as simple as, here's a new form we have to fill in. It's much more comprehensive than that, because it requires ongoing training. And again, it's a point that Jeremy and John made before. It's not as if we get all of this done by the 9th of December and then it's done, we can put it in a box for another year. It's not going away, there's going to be an ongoing requirement. Policies and procedures, again, handbooks, disciplinary policies, we want those to be referring in appropriate circumstances at appropriate levels to steps that might be taken for breaches of the SMCR. Again, I've talked about harassment, and again, it's supposed to drive culture. You want to be making it clear that breaches of these regulations, of this regulatory framework, will potentially be a disciplinary issue. And of course, it's on there in the preparation stage, but it also bites at the back end as well. So regulatory references for people at the appropriate level is something we're going to have to get used to using more and more. And again, there's pro formas, but we need to know what it is. We need to have it on our systems. Again, I'm an employment lawyer. I constantly work with clients who might settle an employment tribunal claim, or they might have a settlement agreement and we'll have a reference in there. Well, under people caught by this framework, we need to make sure that we're applying the correct reference, otherwise we're in breach of the FCA. Sorry, SMCR. Recruitment, again, set steps that we'll need to take in certain circumstances. You know, we need pre-approval of senior managers. We need, so that's FCA pre-approval. The firms need to carry out this annual assessment of fit and proper as it relates to people under the certification regime. We need to, again, everybody in the industry now is gearing up for this, we're all aware of it, but there will be people we take on post 9th of December. We need to make it part of our onboarding, part of our induction process. And again, references need to be in line both at the time and prior to approval. So during the employment, again, I'm sort of repeating some of the points that John made earlier, but all of the documentation that needs to be in place for senior managers, we're going to need to assign SMF functions. At the minute, some of that stuff will just map over automatically, but some of them won't. We need to prepare a statement of responsibility. Again, more documentation needs to be in place. But again, I want to reiterate the point. It's not just a case of having these documents. It's about discussing it with the employees, because if they're not aware of it, it's going to be a big deal. If I'm working in one of these roles and I'm not aware that actually in the future I need to A, be a part of these documents, and B, I might actually get dismissed if I don't live up to them. I think that's a fairly significant thing that people need to be notified of. A really big one for me is notifications. It might be interesting, you know, after I shut up and let other people get a word in edgeways to have a bit chat about that, because I think that's a real interesting area as it relates to employment law and SMCR. So disciplinary action of almost any kind potentially would trigger a notification to the FCA, certainly for senior managers on an ASAP basis and at any point within 7 days. But we have to come up, I think again, something John mentioned before, this notion of an annual return. So an annual return telling the FCA where we've given disciplinary warnings, where we've given drops in remuneration, you know, suspensions as well are included as something that we need to notify them on. So it keeps this really strange situation where, you know, there might be an allegation of bullying, again to the question from our colleague who isn't with us. You know, you could have a situation where somebody makes an allegation of bullying, it might be completely made up, because that does happen. Theoretically, that would trigger a notification to the FCA. And if we're not making notifications to the FCA, I think we need to be able to think about why we're not doing it and be able to explain in the event that we get a tap on the shoulder asking why that is. And again, I've made reference there to consultation with employees. I've touched on this already. But this is a seismic change to the way that some people have carried out their work. It might not be necessarily people in the currently approved regime who are just going to shift over. It might not feel that different to them. But there will be people who have no idea what this is and will feel extremely uncomfortable about it. Excuse me. Especially when the conduct rules apply to everybody basically other than ancillary staff. So it's almost everybody except the guy who cleans the photocopy for you or replaces the toner. It really is that broad. And then after the employment, again, people move on. We're required to submit at certain levels. There's a mandatory template and a regulatory reference, and that covers the last 6 years. The thought process behind that, and again, I think it's quite useful to have this at the forefront of your mind when you consider the employment law issues of what it's trying to achieve. What it's trying to achieve is a situation where the bad apples go from one barrel to another, to another, to another, to another. So that in certain circumstances you have to, regulatory reference has to be provided so that companies are fully aware, people caught by this regulatory framework are fully aware of what they're engaging. And in theory, the FCA want those people out of our industry. And finally, another point on after the employment, and this is more pure employment stuff. Not everybody who leaves an organisation leaves via a settlement agreement. But for the uninitiated, a settlement agreement used to be called a compromise agreement. And it's essentially a contract whereby employee A agrees to leave a company B, usually in return for some money and promising not to sue them. Well, you want to make sure that in that settlement agreement there are certain amendments that such on SMCR. You want to make sure there's a proper handover note in appropriate circumstances. You want to make sure that they'll give you assistance with regulations. And obviously, we don't want to be an organisation, if we can avoid it, that's going to raise the ire of the FCA by making payments to people who've misbehaved. I promised at the outset I'd just include on the slides, and I assume they'll be circulated in due course. I'm not going to read this out. But these are some of the amendments that you could make theoretically to pick up some of the requirements under SMCR. So that's a condition precedent on the front of an employment contract. This appointment is conditional and subject to, and it lists some of the things that you would have to comply with within SMCR. So you make an offer of employment, you could theoretically say to employees, here, offer of employment, we effectively expect you to pass this test, we expect you to comply with SMCR, and we expect the regulatory reference to come back satisfactory. If it isn't, you withdraw the employment. And that's useful from a contractual perspective because it would allow you to withdraw an offer without having to pay notice. That's the front end of the relationship, so that's the condition precedent, a requirement before the contract becomes valid. Termination without notice, and again, I touched on this earlier, the ability to terminate the employment without notice if at some point the employee ceases to be certified as fit and proper. So it gives you a contractual right to terminate that contract in the event that you deem that person isn't fit and proper. None of this stuff would remove their statutory right not to be unfairly dismissed. You would still have to follow a procedure, you would still have to comply with the ACAS code, you would still have to comply with any internal processes, but it's useful to have that there. Because again, what you don't want is a situation where you're terminating an employee and they were to say to you, well, I wasn't aware of my requirements, I didn't know what was expected of me. Yeah, I attended the training, yeah, I did the F&P certification, but it was all a bit of a blur and we didn't really pay much attention to it. Well, paragraphs like that remove that possibility. And finally, just to specify the proper, employee agrees to make an annual declaration that they've not done or failed to do anything that would alter an assessment of fitness and propriety and permit to conduct an annual background check. Again, that gives us the contractual right to make changes. We don't need the contractual right to comply with SMCR, but it does us a favour if we've got the contractual right to do these things because it prevents an employee turning around and saying, well, actually, you breached my employment contract. So I think the final point I want to make is the employment aspects of this are significant. I've talked for 15 minutes. I could probably do another 3/4 of an hour on this stuff. There's a lot to get through. You've still got time. You need to move now. The longer you leave it, the less smooth the path is ultimately going to be. As you would expect, if you do need help with SMCR on the employment side of the regulatory side, Jeremy and I know a lawyer or two who can help you with that. We have a product called SMCR Effect, which is working with organisations on the full range really of issues with SMCR, the training, the documentation and ongoing compliance. So delighted to have a chat with you after the session if anyone wants to hear more about that.
Lovely, thank you very much for that. Some stimulating content there, I thought. I'm sure there are going to be some questions on that from the floor. Would anybody like to kick off? Peter, once again.
Yeah, thank you for that. A request and a question. Okay. The request, you refer to the letter. Yeah. Yeah, very much so. And I've had conversations with the PRA on that topic. So yeah, if we could have a link or a copy so that our colleagues will see that more than myself. The question, can I just take you back and say NDAs? Are you saying to us that if an NDA is agreed, when do we need to tell under the SMCR and what level do we need to say? So if there is an NDA because an individual is up to no good, and we don't actually have categorical evidence so we could take a formal relation with them. So we sort of put that door and keep it in the back pocket on an NDA. Yeah. When we go to the under the SMCR notification side, what do we say to them?
So, you certainly couldn't, I know this indirectly, you couldn't sign an NDA that would promise not to refer them to the FCA in appropriate circumstances. I don't think that would go down very well at all. I think it depends, and just for those who've never dealt with this stuff before, NDA would be either a pure non-disclosure agreement that says you won't tell anything about this, or typically any settlement agreement you sign will include a confidentiality clause, which effectively says we won't tell anybody about this if you won't, basically. So if you had a situation where somebody committed acts of misconduct, I think that at that point that would trigger a notification to, well, if it led to a disciplinary sanction effectively, certainly dismissal, certainly suspension, drop in pay would trigger a notification to the FCA. And I don't think you could use an NDA to try and avoid that.
So if we did the reference request of the FCA, that would trigger, because the problem is, as you rightly identified, it's gone from one apple to another to another to another. I've got a problem that I'm employing somebody that may have been up to review in the previous firm. I don't do that because of a variety of issues. So what references will I get out of the regulator?
Well, it's not out of the regulator, Peter, is it? The new employer will ask the old employer for a reference.
Well, it's interesting you say it, John, because I heard the other day when a very large company was asked for a reference on an individual, and it was he started, he ended, this was his job, and that was his salary. That's all they gave them.
But to be honest, to be completely candid with you, most companies now, that's what they do. They do, which is basically worthless.
Yeah.
But that's what they do.
But that cuts across. I mean, if it was a senior manager role, if somebody was going into a senior manager role for the first time, or transitioning from one senior manager role to another senior manager role in a different firm, for instance, there is a set format with required substance for the reference, which goes well beyond the format that has come to pass as a result of multiple employment law actions, defamation actions, and so forth and so on. So we're heading into a legal environment which is going to be much more complicated and create much more tension. There's a further complicating aspect, which is often overlooked, not just the Principle 11 notification rules you have to be mindful of. There are specific notification rules in the Supervision Manual, Chapter 15, Section 3, which deal with various aspects, but in relation to individuals and misconduct, some of the things they touch on include fraud and other forms of dishonesty. And there are specific rules which say that there must be a notification immediately in the event that an individual is suspected of, in effect, having committed a crime or acted dishonestly in relation to certainly customers, other business operations, key assets of the firm. So when we're talking about these misconduct issues, there's going to be much more tension between what your compliance people want to do, what your general counsel people or external legal advisors want to do, and what your HR consultants, your HR function, and your HR advisors want to do.
I mean, hopefully these are rare sort of circumstances and things. But one thing I suppose is we've got MGAs here to do, and perhaps a possible example of a breach of conduct rules and how you would handle that. What if a member of your staff was writing outside of the binder? What action would you take against them and things? Where do you think that would sit? I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't have an answer for that. But that perhaps could be an example of a breach of the conduct rules. Now that might be a training issue they didn't know, or it might be deliberate because they wanted the business, because they're paid on the amount of business they get through. So just trying to relate it to perhaps some of your more sort of day-to-day work. Likewise, as Jeremy touched on, misusing insurer money, I think again would be very much seen as a breach of the conduct rules. A lot of this comes down to basic things such as honesty or lying and things like that.
Okay, thank you, Jeff.
So, a question to Ian. In general terms, do you feel that the application of the SMCR rules into a business effectively make it easier for employers to sack individuals?
The short answer is yes. And I'm not sure the long answer is going to say a lot more, really. Because, absolutely. Well, certainly, you've got, so the sort of stuff that we're talking about here, so the misconduct, that would trigger a notification under FCA, and that would trigger, potential breach of the conduct rules. It's probably stuff that would be disciplinary anyway. So you're absolutely right, because not only have you got your common law, naughty behaviour, misconduct, you've got another stick to beat them with, to put it into really crude terms. So typically, when we assist a client with a disciplinary issue, you conduct an investigation, you come up with a list of allegations, whatever you want. But you would also, I think, under this regime, you'd also include another paragraph.
Easy refer it to
Yeah,
that,
yeah, absolutely.
link it to it, make it absolute.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, employers often use this idea of bringing a company into disrepute, which is such a strange thing because unless it's publicised, how does it, as a practical matter, bring it to disrepute? But it's chucked in there almost as a, well, we've got all of this specific stuff in there, we'll put this in as a bit of a catch-all. Well, you would almost, under SMNCR, you would include breach of the conduct, the conduct rules, as an actual, real, genuine disciplinary issue that's got teeth. In particular, if you've taken the time to amend your contract of employment to specify that it's a breach, you've amended your policies, your disciplinary policy to specify that it's a breach, and people have had training on it. So you would say, you have committed an breach of, you've not treated customers fairly, or you've not acted with integrity on account of the above, which is a breach of paragraph 4 of the employment contract, section 10 of our disciplinary policy, and ... So yeah, I think it will make it, in one sense, it will make it easier. The point I made before is still right. You're still going to have to go through all the usual hoops of, because even if you comply with
it, just seems to make it more black and white.
It does, I think it does. But from an employment tribunal's perspective, so even if the FCA said, the employment tribunals are run by judges, they don't like being told what to do, they will bear in mind, I would think, what the FCA said about an employee's conduct. But it's a little bit like when a solicitor gets in trouble and the SRA might apply a sanction or not apply a sanction to that employee. It doesn't then follow that the employment tribunal will say, well, the SRA have found that guy's not done anything wrong, we've not struck him off, therefore the dismissal must be unfair. I don't think one necessarily follows the other, but I think it does make it a bit cleaner.
There's also a bigger picture issue about ease of dismissing staff, which is, of course, what SMCR does, it generates data from firms about their HR function, about their workforces, it delivers that data to the FCA. They are able then to generate and look for patterns of behaviour. They're able to look for patterns in the way that firms recruit, hiring, firing, reasons for hiring, firing, etc., etc. And so there's a slightly double-edged sword. If a firm gets into the habit of recruiting people and then dismissing them much more easily, more quickly, has that sort of turnover, questions might well be asked by the regulator as to the processes it goes through in terms of, is it hiring the right people? Are the right people in charge of hiring? Does it really understand what it's meant to be achieving, and so forth? So there is a potential big game changer for the way that firms would be looked at. And there's also something which came out in the UK finance report from a week or so ago, which was the sort of the banking industry's review of how it's gone, SMCR's gone for them. And one of the issues that was raised in that is why a firm was being questioned on, well, you've given us your annual report around this issue, or you've given us a report around this issue, but actually, why didn't you notify these issues, tell us about this earlier? So there's also going to be tension about when to notify and when to report.
Not that I want to use it as an excuse.
Any other questions? Yes.
Taking an example of potentially unsubstantiated bullying that results in a notification to the FCA. What's the FCA going to do with that?
Well, do you know what? I was going to, if nobody else put their hand up, I was going to ask John a question about that stuff. Because that's exactly, again, this session yesterday, I made the point that I could ring up in that afternoon and make an allegation. And if I pitched it at the right level, the employer might have no other option but to suspend. It might be complete nonsense. I could have completely fabricated it. And that would potentially trigger a notification, the suspension of work. And alongside that, and this is more likely, I suppose, as an issue, rather than the completely made-up allegation, is the low-level stuff. So somebody's got a timekeeping issue, or somebody's, I don't know, pulls a sickie and they end up with a warning. Well, strictly speaking, that would trigger a notification. Would it? I mean, because on a strict reading of the framework.
I think that that's not sort of scary one. I mean, I think Jeremy's right that this is going to be data that the FCA hasn't had before. Really, how your HR processes have gone and how many have you disciplined. I mean, rightly or wrongly, it doesn't expect to receive that many. I'll let you in on a secret. We had a discussion did we want firms to report nil returns? And we came to the view, yes, we did, because that's then a conscious decision by the firm that they're not reporting. Or the alternative would be, only tell us if you've had something. But FCA, I think rightly in my view, has gone down the route. Every firm must send in this conduct return, even if it's a nil return. So at least then the FCA has got some comfort that the firm has formally, thought about what they're submitting. So I think, I don't know, it's not quite sure what it's going to get, especially in the light of Lloyds and things like that. If it's going to get an avalanche, what it's going to do. The other thing I would say that the FCA uses and places even more so on at the moment is whistleblowing information. So it takes whistleblowing information, very seriously. It follows that through. Some of that might be, covering its own backside because, something goes wrong. You often get in the press, oh, I told the FCA about this a couple of years ago or whatever. So, the FCA takes a very formal process to whistleblowing. And again, ties in very much with what we talk about culture here. One of the things that team would look at is, well, did that person raise those allegations at the firm in the first place? Yes or no? If yes, well, what happened? Were they properly listened to and thought through by the firm? If no, why not? Did the firm, did the person feel uncomfortable about speaking up? And that's a big plank of what's come out in the Lloyds reports this week. So I think it's going to give the FCA a greater source of information on firms that it hasn't got. But as I said in my speech, and you might know better than me, perhaps we won't have a show of hands who here has had disciplinaries and sacked people at the moment. It's not expecting to see a lot, but it'll be interesting to see what it does get. Likewise, if you send something in, that doesn't automatically mean, enforcement are going to be knocking on your door to say, what's going on here, you sack someone. And I think, perhaps from the sicky point of view, if that gets reported on a form, what the FCA is about is harm to customers and markets and things like that. I suppose, if someone is sacked for lying about being off sick, I think the FCA is probably not going to be that interested, but it's probably safer to over-report than under-report these sort of things, is what I would say.
And you can see how some of that, reporting sickness disciplinary, well, disciplinary is the wrong word, disciplinary action. That could it not be evidence of a culture of bullying?
Yeah.
If you've got an organisation where people are being put under too much pressure, people are being bullied, so it's having a real physical, tangible impact on them, that it leads them to go off sick, and there are ultimately sanctions applied. That's what I think the FCA are going to want to know, and they're going to be wanting to know what is wrong with this culture that stuff happens.
And just going back to one of my slides on the prescribed responsibilities, where 3 of the prescribed responsibilities are people at a firm taking responsibility for each of the levels of SM and CR. Someone is going to be having that prescribed responsibility. I am responsible for ensuring the firm complies with the conduct rules obligations. So that's quite an onus on them. They've got the responsibility, ultimately on what's reported to the FCA. And so if stuff's not reported, FCA finds out about whistleblowing that loads of people have gone and loads of disciplinary action, but that's not on the form, then that person is quite clearly in the frame, I would say, if the FCA was to come in.
David.
I'm also a little bit described by this idea that John, you started with proportionality, and in this case, reported to city. That doesn't sound proportional to me at all. But I'd like to cover the comment. I'm going to hold it clients who go through these disciplinary procedures, probably all warning to the third stage, stage of UP45 people. I dislike this idea of having to report discipline immediately, because I can say, A, that the procedures I have to go through are incredibly patchy. Nobody seems to follow the same procedures. Some of the procedures are very, very poor indeed, because they don't have a whole HR function of the organisation. So, and I wonder where, just in the FCA's thinking, where does innocent until proven guilty actually come from? Because actually, at the end of the day, why am I getting disciplinary procedure on my record and to report that to the FCA and this? I find that a difficult concept, because that just seems to go counter to every principle of English law. Mind you, we've had a decision this week that's turned over 600 years ago. So what do I know about that? But that just worries me a little bit, that we're reporting things that actually really mind that. that actually ultimately may be proven innocent. And I'm just thinking, where does that fit that idea of
So,
the general good?
well, I still think the FCA is not expecting to see much on this, and you as firms probably know yourself, but I think, that's quite a big step if you give someone a written warning or go through a formal disciplinary process. I think that is quite serious. Now, I know Jeremy mentioned the point about Principle 11 and when you should report, but again, it might depend on the time of year, but you have got a year to report if it's not a senior manager. If it's a senior manager, then there's 7 days reporting, and I think it, and references. It's probably more if they leave the firm and they're given a reference that a new firm might not touch them. But I'm not that familiar with how. But I take the point, David, that some enforcement processes can drag on a long period of time, and then I would suggest then you would be updating the FCA on the progress of those disciplinary proceedings. And I think, in fact, it's only when I think FCA only wants to know when it concludes. In a way, if you look at the formal writing of what's there for the conduct report.
Well, we understand that these draws in the wind that the FCA might be rowing back slightly around some of these reporting issues. We understand that there is an open roundtable discussion today going on with certain representatives of the German insurance market, and in particular that the concept of the reporting of suspension, which is would be full pay, neutral, no presumption either way, innocent or guilt, innocence or guilt, would be might potentially be taken off the table or qualified in some way.
I suppose one of the good things.
That's going to be the way. But I just think we're growing in the direction that's really the referencing point. You fill in the form. Do you have to answer the questions to the future employer? Well, that doesn't answer all that I wanted. Do you have to answer the initial questions? No, I don't think you do. So if you actually meet with the information, he has to take it as read, and then it's a case of, well, I'm not going to employ somebody. So you can actually make somebody an employee, could make somebody completely unemployable. And my question then comes around is, well, we already have established a general law that a false reference gives rise to a claim for damages. Is it going to give rise to a claim for damages if the employer says, well, I don't like this guy, I'm just going to put down and accuse them? We're rowing into very dangerous waters on this outside.
No, I can see where you come from, David. I suppose what I would say, and again, as I said earlier, in a way, this regime is already in place for banks and insurers. And as Jeremy reported, the UK Finance Report as to how it's gone in banking made some recommendations in this sort of area. So I think, unless a sort of senior manager does something wrong at one of your firms on the 11th of December, there is a bit of time for staff. And, I've asked, so I have contacts at the FCA, I've asked, like they have done, already put something out on how it's gone down in banking. It would be helpful, once they've got more reports from these conduct reports in from the banking side, what sort of thing they're seeing, how much they're seeing, whether they've got any recommendations for future reporting.
Well, I'd like to think that most of our MGA members within the MGA are not bankers, and that we're not charged with the same pressures the banking industry.
Time for one last question. We're just nearly up on time. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that gentleman's question. Going back to your suggested amendment to the contract, the fitness proprietary one.
Yeah.
I think it's a question that's going to get asked by a lot of the staff. How do you balance the already existing employment rights, so that the period that you've got to investigate, the 3 months to take to employment tribunal, or the pre-existing employment rights, against what seems to be quite confusing as to what point you're supposed to notify the FCA, and then the suggested clause in your contract, which seems very final, without notice.
Yeah.
And then you've obviously got another clause in the contract which says your notice period is X, subject to gross misconduct, etc. So is it worth kind of having the two clauses kind of as a mixture of the other? So you will be dismissed if you breach the contract clause, but obviously subject to your normal notice period.
So it's if we're talking about senior managers, so a contract in a clause of the contract which basically says we reserve the right to terminate your employment for breach of conduct rules of welfare. That's not. It wouldn't be it's not out of kilter with a senior exec contract now, which will say we have the right to terminate without notice if you commit a material breach of this contract anyway.
Yeah.
So that's just, it would be a contractual right to terminate. You're right, I mean, they would still have, I think I made the point before, even if you've got the contractual right to terminate under the employment contract, that dismissal would still have to be unfair as it relates to the Employment Rights Act. So you still have to follow a fair procedure, you still have to have a fair reason to dismiss, and you still have to come to a decision which is within the range of reasonable response.
So whilst they're going through that investigation,
Yeah.
the FCA notification will already have happened?
It depends if you suspend them or not. If you suspend them, then theoretically, yeah, you subject to the point that Jeremy made earlier. But the point, and this is what the gentleman made the point before, I agree with him. If you've got an employee accused of misconduct and you suspend them, as a practical matter, that triggers notification. So you could have an alleged act of misconduct, suspension, notification goes up, and then the investigation carries on.
Yeah.
Now, there's another point, it wasn't still on the slide, but there's another point in the regulations that talks about appeals. So they want to be told if somebody's dismissed. They also want to be told if an appeal is submitted and crucially kept up to date on the progress of that appeal. Because theoretically, it doesn't happen very often, but somebody could be dismissed for gross misconduct. And then if the appeal is successful, then in law, the dismissal disappears. But that does create a slightly unfortunate, and I agree with you, a difficult situation for the employee, because that employee has had, technically 3 notifications to the FCA in respect to them, albeit it would be on the annual basis unless it was a senior manager or sufficiently serious, and ultimately they've been exonerated.
And then what happens with the notifications if if it turns out that the allegation wasn't true? The notifications presumably are removed from. Because then obviously a regulatory reference that gets requested, will those notifications appear on that regulatory reference, or presumably they just get wiped?
Well, I think regulatory references have to be updated if they are revised in the light of what comes to light after they've been given.
If the employee is exonerated, then
it would affect the regulatory reference, and it has to be resubmitted.
But it's far from clear from what I did in the case a couple of years ago. It's far from clear that there is expunging of records at the FCA where there's been a notification around an individual's conduct.
But then presumably the firm would have, as
the references are between new firm and old firm and not the FCA. So.
But presumably then the firm would have to update the record, update the FCA and say nothing came of this, so that would be anyway.
There, I think we have to leave it. We're pretty much up and on time. Thank you very much to our speakers. You may wish to join me in giving them a round of applause.